Hey, everybody. This is Jelena Oxley with Grand Strand Together, Action Together. And I'm really excited to be interviewing a couple of friends today about activism. So, as you all know, we've been having a very busy summer in terms of the Black Lives Matter activism, and we're really excited about that. And so, what we thought we'd do is take an opportunity to reflect on what is activism. So, some of us may have attended our first protest. You may have written your first letter to the editor. You may have made your first sign, or you may just be sitting at home outraged and not sure what to do because there's a pandemic going on. So what we're going to do tonight is really just kind of reflect on what activism is. I recently just read a headline a few minutes ago that I believe it's the Milwaukee Bucks are boycotting their game, which was supposed to be for tonight as a form of protest regarding the killing of Mr. Blake and I know it's Kenosha. I believe it was in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So that's another interesting question in terms of what our opportunities are for activism. So let me introduce you to our panelists, our friends, our people that we're going. Oh, I'm sorry. Blake is still alive. Thank you, Jalen. I should have emphasized that. I believe, is he paralyzed? Is that correct? Yeah, that's right. That's right. So paralyzed. I'm sorry, I've been driving all day, so I have my news is a little bit, I haven't been reading Facebook as much as I should. So let me tell you about the folks we're going to be interviewing tonight. So first of all, I want to introduce you to Jalen Elrod, and Jalen is a community organizer and a fifth generation Greenvillian in Greenville, South Carolina. He's a member of the Community Remembrance Project, which is a local coalition partnered with the Equal Justice Initiative to honor the victims of racial terror lynchings in Greenville County. And he is the former first vice chair of the Greenville County Democratic Party. So welcome, Jalen. We're excited to have you. Very excited to have you. And our next person that we're going to have a conversation with tonight is Amanda Masterpaul. And Amanda is a theater professor at Coastal Carolina University, where I work. And she does applied theater practitioner, where she weaves together social consciousness, cultural competency, and activist spirit into her everyday experience and into her courses, where she does activist theater. Her goal is to raise critical consciousness and have an intersectional integration to work to challenge the inequities for a better vision for tomorrow. She's worked as a teacher, a director, a theater of the oppressed facilitator, and a joker. We need to hear what that's about. And she's had a wide range of different work in the nonprofit sector. And she has recently completed an MA in social justice and community organizing with Prescott College. Wow. So we have two really different perspectives on activism tonight. So I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say about this. So first of all, let's just start off. And Jalen, I'd like to hear from you. Can you just describe your activism? So tell us what you do in terms of activism. And I know that activism in many ways is like a way of life. So it's probably 1,000 different things, but see if you could boil it down into what you do as an activist.
Well, I would define activism as how you bring about change in your community. Mm-hmm. And for me, that activism, that protest, that fight for justice centered around the issue of gentrification in our city, in the city of Greenville. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned before, my family has been in a Greenville community called West Greenville for generations. It's a traditionally Black community. And I think it's important to note that my mother, my grandfather, my great-grandparents, those who went before them, they lived in West Greenville because, frankly, Black folks couldn't go anywhere else besides West Greenville. And now, because of our incumbent mayor and this, well-praised revitalization that's happening in Greenville, West Greenville and other traditionally Black communities are being gentrified beyond recognition. And Wow. It is a huge problem. a problem that goes underreported, a problem that our city and our county council and our leadership, if you will, frankly, does they do a poor job of addressing if they do any work at all in trying to address the issue. So what I've been doing for the past 5 years, working with local churches, other community initiatives, working through the Democratic Party, is try to raise awareness about that injustice and try to fight to bring about change to keep our neighborhoods intact, if you will, because I believe, not just because of my own familial ties to the communities, but because of what others did before me, those who fought in the civil rights movement, those who had to endure Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
What they did in our communities, it's important that it's passed on to the next generation. And I see that history, that legacy being tarnished. So that's really how I got involved in politics. And then again, it led to me being involved in so many other things, our NAACP chapter, our Black Lives Matter chapter for a time, the local Democratic Party, fighting not just for against gentrification, but for police reform, for increased funding to public transit, myriad other things that we know our community and our state need. So I would again define activism in my life and in my journey as fighting for social justice and social upward mobility in a community that refuses to invest in it.
Yeah. Wow. That's really powerful. Yeah, that's great. Amanda does the snaps.
The snap
Um,
thing.
that's
I do this. Praise. Be in solidarity with. Something.
That's great. That's great. So I have a few follow-up questions, but I feel like they might come a little bit later. So I'm going to just, tuck them back away in my brain. And then I'll have Amanda, let me hear from you in terms of what is your activism like?
Yeah. So activism for me is it's a combination of performance and collective action. So being a theater maker, being a artist, and how to merge arts-based practices in with activism. So a recent effort I did in the spring was a collaborative production called Liberation City, which was between theater students at Coastal Carolina University and youth and young adults who are experiencing homelessness that are locally present here in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The production itself was actually canceled. We were put on lockdown the week of our tech and production timeline. So we had everything like on go. We were ready. Had people in place. We had mobilized everything. So what we ended up doing was continuing efforts online. And Liberation City was a organizing campaign that centered performance with and for impacted communities in order to elevate community-centered social, political, and economic solutions for youth homelessness. For 2020, 2021, we're actually expanding upon this effort through a socially informed artists in residence program with Project Lighthouse, which is the entity and the organization that we've been working with, which is in downtown Myrtle Beach and serves youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. When you think about like arts and activism, why is there a benefit? How do these two kind of facets, they might seem like polar opposites, but how do they really intersect? And a lot of it is like rooted in the same principles. You've got deliverables of like building relationships and sustaining relationship, about having healing centered engagement or accountability, and innovation and creativity, which is centered around how are we providing livability and a quality of life that is connected to overall culture and wellness and life and fortitude and resiliency, right? And then also arts-based practices are really focused on empowering people to move from beyond being like just a passive observer, just riding in the passenger seat, and really moving into the driver's seat and being active agents for change. So you're literally building through arts practices the social and political efficacy to do something. And culture is power. So stories and narratives, they define the culture that we have. And so as a result, if we shift narratives, especially around communities that are experiencing oppression and marginalization, away from depictions of them being like deficit and poor, right? And these kind of tropes, and moving them more into strength-based strategy, resilient models and narratives, we can actually shift culture in relationship to that through artistic practice, through storytelling. In addition, during quarantine, I created a troupe of artists and activists called Solidarity and Isolation. And we've been meeting virtually since April. And upcoming on Saturday, September 5th, I'm actually partnering with a former student and dear friend, Donia Murad, who will actually be leading an interactive experience about the sexual harassment crisis in the Egyptian community and how we can make a change through art and education. The event is entitled Muffled Voice, and it's going to explore our options as active civilians in the community to enact social change and spread awareness on issues around consent, assault, and social and political laws that actually have been perpetuating these issues for decades within their community. And it really is this kind of like cross-cultural international exchange that's going to be happening on a virtual platform. And so I'm really excited to just support like a former student and taking this project on and seeing like the fruits of the labor just like multiplying,
That
it's
sounds
really
really
beautiful.
cool. That sounds really cool. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing all that. That sounds really awesome. So I just want to pick up on a theme that both of you mentioned, which is that activism is important because it's not necessarily through like a specifically a government channel, which is to say that like politics has a role, but there's another job to be played outside of politics. And it's interesting. I was teaching a philosophy of law class this last semester, and one of the authors was arguing that because of Americans' like inherent distrust of government, you almost have to work outside of government in order to facilitate change. And then eventually it'll trickle up, right? But it's not necessarily a trickle down. So, and if you look at some of the social change that's taken place in recent decades, it's largely because on the ground there was a big change, and then eventually, there were policies or Supreme Court judgments that were changed. So I think that's really important that both of you have picked up on that. So let's talk about South Carolina for a minute. So when I was, becoming an activist several years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a historian, and I was like, wow, look at this. Like South Carolina's finally woken up, and we're like becoming, maybe there's more progressive people here now. And she was like, South Carolina's had activists for a long time. And I just didn't, I had read the wrong history books. So tell us what are your observations about activism in South Carolina? We're typically, a red Republican state. And now we sort of have a little bit more grassroots movement. So what are your observations and thoughts about what's going on in South Carolina in terms of activism today? Jalen, we'll start with you.
I think there has been a significant uptick in activism, not just recently in light of the reemergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, but I think especially you've seen this uptick after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, where you saw so many different factions on the progressive side that had been not as active as they could have been, really rise up and get involved in so many different avenues. I took over our Young Democrats chapter in Greenville a day before Donald Trump was elected. It really sent me on this whirlwind that I never expected. People who had never been involved in the local party, at least, came and really got involved at the local level. It led to a significant uptick in people running for local office, for state office, for Congress, activism in the streets, if you will. So much of a variety of perspectives and life experiences that really just came together. I hear you as a person who's worked numerous campaigns. South Carolina is a very red state. And, hopefully we can see some change in that this year with Jamie Harrison. But I want to touch on something that both of you talked about, which is I'm so proud of this activism because, like you mentioned earlier, it's really working outside of those political and governmental elements that change happens. And when you mentioned the arts, one of my favorite movies is Selma. And it's one of my favorite movies because it depicts John Lewis, who just recently passed away, and him and 600 other people marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, and being beaten by police so horridly, so brutally. I tell people all the time that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was written in blood, the blood that was shed on that bridge.
Mhm.
And we even see now with the massive protests surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement and how it gave way to the House of Representatives passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is still stalled in the Senate. And hopefully, if we can get new leadership in Washington in November, it can get passed. But a bill like that would not have been fathomable, not even a year ago, not even 4 years ago. And it's that demonstrations, what many are calling the largest demonstrations in history under the banner of Black Lives Matter, that really facilitated that. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill addresses things like ending qualified immunity for police, like strengthening the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department so that they have the resources to investigate police brutality and misconduct, lowering the federal threshold that's needed to charge police officers with deprivation of civil rights. Is really completely and utterly compact with the reforms that we have been out in the streets demanding. So I definitely hear you on that. That bill would not have been possible if it had been initially supported by any politician, by any establishment leader, if you will. It's really the people who marched in the streets that brought that about. And I think that same fervor, that same spirit we're seeing in South Carolina. So while we see criminal justice and police reform being a national issue now, I think our activists here are really fighting to bring about that change here in South Carolina and within our own communities.
Yeah, that sounds great. I agree. Amanda, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to lift up, some entities and organizations that I think are like are pinnacles and representatives of activism. So like, for example, like South Carolina for Ed, is an organization of public school educators and affiliates, that have advocated for pay equity and educational equity and oversight and testing reductions and more. And they had a monumental large protest, on the courthouse steps, of Columbia. And so then, we also have this history actually of prolific resistance within the prison systems of our state, which has been really interesting. The Free South Carolina movement and the Jailhouse Lawyers speak. They've called for better jail conditions, for fair wages for jobs done by prisoners, and restoring voting rights to felons, and increased funding for rehabilitation services and expansion to those services. And the Women's Rights and Empowerment Network in Columbia, South Carolina has actually worked with numerous organizations and entities that are serving gender equity throughout the entire state. And recently, they were very integral in getting the Lactation Support Act passed, which is going to provide employees break time to express breast milk in a clean, like private location, and so I think that we are seeing legislative moves and push, to maybe more aggressive and progressive acts. And then I also question whether or not, though, like in our state, if our movements are fragmented. And so I would really love in our future to see more collective mobilization across the state, because just at face value, the kind of more progressive areas that we typically hear and see about are Charleston, Columbia, Greenville, and so really kind of going across the borders, across the state to be more formalized and mobilized across different sectors and disciplines. I would love to see in our future of activism in the state in particular.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree with you. And it does seem like it's the metropolises or the metropoli that do seem to have a little bit more, progressive movement. But I think it's wonderful. And I've heard about so many small towns in South Carolina having, Black Lives Matter demonstrations. So, I think it's totally important to emphasize that the wildfire will spread, right? As soon as it gets close to you, you could be like, hey, we can do that too. They're 30 minutes down the line, we can do the same thing they're doing. So I think that's been really inspirational. So you guys gave some great examples of things that are happening in South Carolina. And since we're having more of an uptick in South Carolina, I want to kind of return to this question about like, what should your average person who's interested in activism, how should they best pursue it? And so one of the ways I was thinking about this is in terms of like, what's not like, I mean, I'm a boring philosopher, so I like, what's the definition of activism? But also in the sense of like, is there a difference between activism that's effective? And I'm also curious about what you think about performative activism. And Amanda, not necessarily like in terms of theater, but like, I wonder about activism that is symbolic, and then activism that's really making a difference. And so, like, is there a way to is performative, like, what are some bad ways to be an activist? Or have you seen some forms of activism that are problematic, whether it's like somebody just trying to steal the show the whole time and like not giving a platform to other people? What are some things that you think about, like what constitutes activism? And Jalen, well, I want to hear from you.
When we talk about performative activism, I think that's a very slippery slope, because I think the first thing you have to talk about when you discuss performative activism is who is going to define what performative activism is.
Yeah.
Some great advice I got a few years ago is that in terms of what's going on here in Greenville, the challenges we face are so great as a Black community that we need multiple lines of attack, if you will. The Greenville News have recently did an article on the conflict, for lack of a better term, between our NAACP chapter and our Black Lives Matter chapter.
Okay.
And really what we had to decide, or the conclusion we came to, is that it was really important for each of us to play our part, right? So I think that idea harkens back to the civil rights movement, where you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led by John Lewis. Their actions differed greatly with the actions of the Southern Christian Leadership Council led by Dr. King, and how ultimately they were able to work together, playing to their strengths to bring about that change. And I say all that to say, what is one person's performative activism? It's another person's way of fighting for change in their life, fighting for change in their city, and fighting for change in their community. Of all the activism I've seen in my life, especially over the past 5 years, I can probably count on one hand the number of acts I would consider performative. Rather, I've learned to really get to know people and their intentions and what they want to do, and realize you really can't walk in another person's shoes or know their struggles or what they've been through in their lives.
That's great. Wow. I feel like that was some wisdom that you just like dropped on
It's
it.
definitely not my wisdom. Somebody told me that
Like, you have internalized it. I'm like, oh, I need to like write that down and remind myself that, that activism is activism, and that we can't, it's not that you can't judge, but that if we're all working together, we do need multiple lines of attack. We need lots of people to be involved. I know that when I first started with Ashland Grand Strand Action Together, people were like wanting instructions, and I'm like, we just started this like last week. I don't have any specific instructions to give. We need all the help we can get. So like, just, come on with your ideas and, just run with it, So yeah, you're right. It's very, we do need lots and lots of people to be involved. Amanda, what do you think about that? What I was saying?
So this was this is a really interesting question, because obviously I'm a performer and an artist,
right.
And so like as an artist, we've been traditionally trained to be presentational. There's so much glamour that comes from the spotlight and everything, but for me personally, I really hold myself fiercely accountable to set an example for those in my sphere of influence. I'm very dear to holding ethics of humility and integrity in the work, and I really am more curious about the meaning and motivation for the response and the activism, and I think we need to be critical and hold our counterparts accountable to question whether the performance is also coupled with collective action, if it's not, then what is the performative activism serving? However, like, I gotta say, like, being a professor of students too, like I toggle many different hats in many different worlds, but being a professor of students who might be in their infancy of activism, performative activism, especially on social media, right? Like might be where they have to begin. It's just, maybe it's just not where we remain, like it's a could be a great starting point and it does send out a message. But I think if we really unpack it, we think about like, what is the meaning? What's the purpose? What's the response? Why we're doing what we're doing? And if we really are looking at it from multiple lines of attack, like both of you have said, we need any and all strategies to make it happen, to make the change happen.
I think that's great. I think that's really, really wonderful. So this kind of tags along to the same questions, but like, what all have you learned about activism, like since you started doing it? Do you feel like that there are mistakes that you've made, or like mistakes that you've seen other people make that you might try to avoid? I don't know if in history there are examples of mistakes that people make as activists. I mean, I feel like for me, it's very much a learning process, and it's like a trial balloon. Let's try it, see how it goes. And, if it fails, it fails. There's not much to lose by trying. Is that your experience as well? Or what have you learned about activism as you've been engaging in it? Jalen, I'd like to hear from you. We'll start with you.
Okay. One thing I've definitely learned over the past 5 years is that you should not alienate people who could potentially be your allies, right? I learned that you should get to know people and not just go off your initial perception of them. I think if you would have talked to me 4 years ago, that was a big thing that I was doing that I learned not to, because you never know somebody's history, you never know, again, someone's struggles, what someone's perspective is and why they have that perspective. What I've learned regarding activism and bringing about change is that I wanted, early when I started this, when I took over our Young Democrats chapter, a little bit about me. I always thought that the Democratic Party only came around to Black communities and other marginalized communities when we wanted to vote. And then when it was when election season wasn't happening, we were just absent. So I really wanted our Young Democrats chapter to be ingrained in our communities, ingrained what it looked like to our Black communities, our Latino communities, our impoverished communities. And one thing I learned that I took from SNCC, actually, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is that you have to ingrain yourselves in these communities. And that led me to go to churches in those communities, attend Bible studies in those communities, go to their neighborhood association meetings, volunteer at their community centers, things like that. Really get to know the people who I claim to be helping and the people whose needs I claim to be championing, rather than just coming into their community during election time and say, hey, vote for this candidate, right? Because I think one thing we do as a Democratic Party and as progressives is that we judge people who don't vote instead of seeing it for their perspective, which is like, well, your candidate seems disingenuous that they only come into our communities when they want to vote. So why should we think they should care? Again, that's a whole nother conversation, but there are myriad reasons why people don't vote. Some mistakes I've seen other people make outside of mine is that we've had a plethora of Democratic candidates who have run in Greenville over the past few years, and many, if not most of them, have failed. And I think that can be attributed to some extent to the fact that a lot of these candidates, from what I've seen, in my capacity as the Young Democrats head, in my capacity as first vice chair, and just as a community organizers, that these people really weren't ingrained in their communities at all before they ran. They're introducing themselves to their communities when they're running. And I think for those who run at the local level, you don't need to be introducing yourself when you run. Folks need to already know who you are, or else, how can you say that, oh, I'm different from every other politician that's just asking for your vote and just coming around and pretending to care about your needs now that I'm running for office, now that I want to seek this power. So those are mistakes that I've made personally. Those are mistakes I've seen others make that I've learned from. And I think, I was actually reflecting about this the other day with a friend. I've really seen my own growth happen over the Trump years, if you will, when so many of us learned what it means to be activists, what it means to be involved in our community, when we really focused on ourselves and what change we wanted to see in our communities, and whether or not we were willing to take the measures necessary to be the change in our communities. You're muted.
You're on mute.
I'm sorry. I was trying to not interrupt you. My children are in the next room. I was like, I don't want them to hear them. Yeah. So, it seems like to some extent, at least being an organizer, an activist who, when you do it every day, it involves some sacrifice, at least in time. And not pursuing your own projects, or I feel like I haven't watched TV in a long time, and but that's just probably my fault. But it does involve involves taking a lot of risks, and I think that that's probably one of the most challenging things for me as an activist, is to just get over the fact that, like, I'm taking a risk, right? I just need to not be afraid to do that. But I like your idea of reflecting on how you can kind of come into your own as an activist, and it totally seems like you're doing that, Jalen. Amanda, what do you have to say about this? About
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Jalen said, and just affirm again and lift up like radical respect for a community. Like when he was talking about like going to churches and going to Bible studies and like living life with the people that you're doing the work with and you're organizing and doing your activism with, I think is so essential. And one principle that I try and use, and I'll try and influence others to kind of adopt this as well, is if you yourself wouldn't like walk or live in that community and you're doing the work in the community, that needs to be scrutinized, you know? So I think, like, again, especially like coming from a white lens, okay, it's like a white woman going in and working with communities, right, of difference, whether it's racially, class, gender, sexuality, whatever, right, that those principles need to be scrutinized. And if you yourself won't immerse yourself, and have radical respect for that community and it not be presentational, right, but really be authentic and genuine, and forming and forging those relationships that are so central to the work. You're hearing about people's lived experience, you're doing life with them, and you're like as you're working with them, you're strategizing because you believe in people, because you have like this deep respect, and you want a better quality of life for everyone, and for the people that you're involved with. And I just think, like, things that I've learned is you got to have healing. Like, you got to have healing for yourself, space and healing for yourself, and do the same for community. And I think it's really important to also understand that we're human beings that are like taking on trauma and suffering and hurt, but we're also taking on joy and pleasure and community. And when we're doing this work together, that we offer up opportunities to check in, we offer up space. We don't imagine that people are just robots and just going to show up, all the time, right? That like life plays a role in all of this. And how are we negotiating all those circumstances? For me, something that I've really learned in this is just like being able to be very vulnerable and transparent, because that trust has to be built first and foremost in order for us to really forge authentic relationships to do the work together and to make concrete change happen. So that's what I got.
Yeah, that seems exactly right. I think that those things are so important, because social change is not something you can accomplish on your own. And so just igniting the passion in other people is half the job. So I want to talk a little bit about race for a minute in activism, and the importance of centering and platforming Black voices in particular, and maybe not just with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, but with activism in general. So for the past, like when I first started doing activism, I was very concerned about making sure that I always had some kind of diversity, because I was very aware of the history of the feminist movement, which was super white, and they marginalized Black voices for decades. And so that's something that I've always been aware of, and I haven't always succeeded at it, just for various reasons, not for lack of trying. But it seems like there's this tendency for white women especially to get more listened to, or like more of a platform. And that must be white supremacy or something like that. But I'm curious, what do you think about the role of race and particularly in Black voices, and that the importance of that, and not just for the current moment, but for activism in general moving forward? So, Jalen, would you mind addressing that?
Yeah, I'll tell my own personal perspective.
Okay.
Most of the activism and the organizing that I've been doing over the past few years has been centered around the issue of gentrification.
Okay.
So I really want to frame my argument or my perspective in that sense rather than the sense of the Black Lives Matter movement in the
Okay.
aftermath of George Floyd being murdered, because that's relatively recent. A
Yes.
big problem we've been having in Greenville, from what I see, is that I view, and I believe what I say is fact, that gentrification is racial injustice, is 21st century housing segregation. It is the displacement and the erasure of culture. And what we've had in Greenville is a lot of gentrifiers claim to be allies to the cause. Right now, I'm currently in Nicholtown at Nicholtown Baptist Church, and I've ridden past some houses that have Black Lives Matter signs in front of them. And one thing about Nicholtown, like West Greenville, is that this is a community that white folks wouldn't come into 20 years ago. And now, because downtown is so vibrant, everyone's moving in. And one of the questions that I asked that really frankly pisses people off is that, can you be a true ally of the Black Lives Matter movement? Can you be a true ally of the Black community? Can you be opposed to gentrification if you're a gentrifier? How can
Yeah.
you claim to be opposed to a racial injustice that you contribute to? And I think that falls into an overall argument of white liberals, particularly caring about racial equality and racial injustice to the extent that it doesn't hinder them from exercising their privilege, right? I think that white liberals care about racial equality and racial injustice until you say, oh, well, maybe you shouldn't move into this certain community because you're erasing its culture and its history, and also you're diluting Black political power, minority political power, considering depending on where you are.
Right.
Also, with the Community Remembrance Project, we just read a book by Dr. King called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos Our Community. And
Yeah.
one of the things Dr. King argued before he died was that white folks, especially white liberals, cared about Black folks being treated decently, but not being treated with equality. He made the example that brutality such as what happened in Selma or in Birmingham or in Rock Hill even, that made white folks aggrieved to the extent that it was brutal. But when you talked about issues such as making the war on poverty more inclusive racially, when you talked about reparations, when you talked about that nuts and bolts, they didn't like that. They liked that, they could stand against brutality. But when you talk about equality, that's a whole nother conversation. And that's really has been my experience with, white voices, particularly white liberals in the community, whether or not they be gentrifiers and claiming to be allies, or whether or not they claim to be for equality when they're really just for decency.
Yeah, wow. So that's a big one. So that actually brings me to my follow-up question, which I have filed away and which I thought about earlier on. Um, so how do you see, can you define for us or explain to us the difference between gentrification and then like affordable housing?
Mhm.
And I guess the reason I'm asking this is because in most cities in America, we have a quote unquote affordable housing crisis. And certainly in Myrtle Beach, we have people that need to come and work at the beach and they have to live an hour away just to have somewhere to live because they're being paid such horrible wages, right? So what's the difference between gentrification and affordable housing?
Well, I'll frame it this way. We just did the Community Remembrance Project in November, where we honored the first lynching victim. We were going to honor George Green. And to make a long story short, George Green was lynched because his landlord tried to evict him unjustly. And when his landlord was not able to do that through legal means, he called the Klan and they lynched him. And we made that relevant by saying, this happened to George Green, and this is what's happening to Black people now. And one of the things that we argued was that the difference between gentrification and revitalization is equity. Equity for marginalized communities, equity for disenfranchised communities, equity for communities of color. We've seen a lot of gentrification in Greenville, but we haven't seen a lot of revitalization. We've seen a lot of we've seen a renaissance, if you will, that benefits an esoteric few, that benefits the affluent and the powerful, but that doesn't really help the working class. It doesn't help your cashiers or your construction workers or your waitresses or your Uber drivers, if you will. And it feels like you have the same problem down there in Myrtle Beach. Working class people are not being able to benefit from what's happening. And I think that's a challenge that we have to tackle, and is something that we need to address, that our leaders need to address, that they haven't. Some people think that gentrification is good. It's like, no, revitalization is good. When the people who are currently in these communities can enjoy the money that's being invested in, that is good, that is just. But when you have gentrification, when you have these jokes like opportunity zones that Tim Scott and even some Democrats have proposed over the past few years, you're just perpetuating that injustice and exacerbating this problem.
So can you say, I'm sorry, this is a topic that I really think is just super interesting. Can you say more about what the opportunity zones are and like why, you would oppose them?
Yeah, I think opportunity zones essentially created a tax haven for the rich. It didn't take into account that communities have been gentrifying for years. And the idea is that you're going to have this massive investment in minority communities, in impoverished communities. It's really it was idealistic to the point of being naive, in my opinion. And the people who opportunity zones were supposed to benefit, this isn't my opinion, I think this is based in solid fact now, based on data from the Treasury Department. It is essentially, again, creating a tax haven for the rich and the powerful to make more money, and it's being done again at the expense of the impoverished and the disenfranchised.
Yeah. So it's not the same as revitalization at all, because it's not investing into the community.
Not at all.
It's more of creating opportunities for the wealthy to create more wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the city that I'm most familiar with is San Francisco, because I have some friends who do philosophy of the city and activism out there. And the main problem is that the working people are getting driven out of their own communities. So to be, to have a blue, quote unquote, blue collar job, to be a maid, or, to work in, retail, just to have, not a tech industry job, you have to live an hour outside of town, which is ridiculous, right? For people who have lived, 20 minutes from where they've been able to work their entire life, that creates, massive disparities in terms of your quality of life, right? So it's not, and people are like, well, you can get the wages. And it's like, at some point, the amount of money, that you're going to make for, as, a maid, is not going to make up for the fact that you're spending 2 hours, on public transit that you lost, right? From being able to spend with your time, or, leisure or relaxation or sleep or whatever. So I feel like those kinds of things are definitely not taken into account when people are doing urban planning, right? So when you plan a city, you need to build in, space for people to have, housing that's affordable housing, so that like you can have all the little moving parts of society that you need for your society to thrive, and not just the wealthy people living in the middle where all the restaurants are and everybody else having to flock in and move while, they sit around. But I hear you when it comes to the liberals. This is a very tricky topic because, a lot of, like, as you're describing with Dr. King, the white moderate, doesn't necessarily want their own lifestyle to change. And they want to live in a nice place. And as long as other people are, getting to do their thing, then they may not want to get out of their comfort zones very much.
Exactly.
And so that's a big challenge, for for white people. Amanda,
Yeah, and I'll jump in as a white person, obviously.
yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, white liberals, right? Like um we can do astronomical harm on like a daily micro level all the time consistently, which is like a paper cut wound that just won't heal, right? It's just continuous. Um, I'm going to say that as a white activist, a white female activist carrying a legacy of harm, right? And in movement building work, that, I also have to understand that I do have an expertise to offer, and I have to claim that expertise. However, I am first and foremost a vessel, and I really do see myself in this way. My work really does lie within intently listening to the community and collaborating alongside them and developing a creative and proactive strategy and plan, right? That's like code defined outcomes that are community centered, not some formulaic agenda that I've like brought into the space or brought into the community to say from the outside looking in, here's what needs to be fixed, right? Or here's what needs to be saved. But to really experience the community, to be in solidarity, to be in collaboration and partnership with for their goals. They don't need to be saved. We all need the tools to save ourselves. That's what we need. We need the tools to save ourselves. And I think being really explicit about your identities when you go into spaces of difference. So saying, I am white, I am like cis female, this is my sexuality, this is who I am, like being radically transparent about that, that frees people, I'm telling you. And just like owning your mistakes, owning, being transparent, holding yourself accountable to that, and allowing the community to enhance that for you is just paramount, like just so paramount. To kind of jump onto the conversation that you were having about gentrification and affordable housing, I want to look at it from a homelessness perspective and kind of bring in another context, because that's a lot of the work that I've been doing with artistic activism. And nonprofit agencies, or what we're going to call like the nonprofit industrial complex, they really arose as like a neoliberal response to serving homeless and unhoused populations. So, for example, like within the context of the project that I did, Liberation City, I worked alongside a collective of nonprofits who were literally put to task to solve local homelessness, all while struggling fiscally and operationally to even survive, right? And all the while, the city is deferring their responsibility to this nonprofit industrial complex to resolve or temporarily solve homelessness, which actually allows the city to escape their responsibility for implementing rapid response, for implementing relief aid in times of crisis, or for really sustaining any structural changes for affordable housing or for minimum wage increases or for overall quality of life programming, right? In resolutions. So this is what is just such an interesting tension and parallel between, the nonprofit industries that are supposed to like save us essentially and provide these resources, when ultimately what's doing is we're just caught up in that institutional cycle that isn't being changed because the city has really absolved themselves of the responsibility to have to take it on.
Yeah. So I think that you're exactly right. That's a major, I mean, I guess that can be a hindrance of activism because it allows the state to get off the hook from doing the things that they ought to be doing. But that's also probably strategic. And like you're saying, part of the neoliberal strategy or something like that for like, to allow more trickle down economics to govern, how the country is run, which doesn't seem to work. And it certainly doesn't seem to work in a pandemic where you have multiple people becoming, double the billionaire they were before the pandemic started, and so many people barely being able to scrape by. So that seems like you're living in a third world country if we've got that kind of disparity going on. Which, no offense against third world countries, I love third world countries. That didn't come out right, but it seems like we have some major problems of inequity, economic, certainly, in addition to the social inequity, which has been the case for hundreds of years. So we've got, as I'm seeing it, about 10 or 15 minutes to wrap up. So I want to hear your opinion on, so you guys are activist organizers and you've been, hitting the pavement and being creative for years. What would you say to somebody who wants to get involved as an activist and is not sure what to do? Do you think that like anybody can be an activist? Do people need to be careful, like their jobs? Like we've heard of people getting fired for different things. What kind of factors should people take into account if they want to get into activism? Jalen, I'll turn that over to you first.
Okay. I think anyone that wants to be an activist can be an activist in their own way. There's not one single defined way to be an activist. Activism is more than marching in the streets. It's more than voting. It's more than going to city council meetings or county council meetings. Anytime you're fighting or perpetuating the cause of justice in your sphere, whether it's in your community, in your state, in the country, or globally, you're doing that good work, right? That's one of the things I've learned from someone who I greatly admire, a mentor of mine in Greenville, Leola Robinson Simpson, who was very active in the civil rights movement here in Greenville in the 1950s and 60s, being arrested multiple times, being beaten by police, and how that activism translated to her going to the school board and fighting for our kids there. Then that translated to her going to the state house, representing my district, District 25, in the state house, and really fighting for change. And I would say to somebody who wants to be an activist, find out what you're passionate about, and then find out what you're good at, and then combine those things and go out and fight the good fight. I don't think there's one way to be an activist, and I think anybody can make a change in their community. Anybody can be a change agent, as they say.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it. Amanda, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I agree. Anyone and everyone can be an activist. My mentor, Augusto Boal, who created Theater of the Oppressed, you know, the belief is that everyone can do theater. It's theater for the people, by the people, and activism is the same. It's activism for the people, by the people. It's the idea and the premise that we don't have to be extraordinary. We can just be ordinary and we can do extraordinary things, like in partnership and in collaboration with one another. I think that we do need to value equity, and I think that this idea of like yourself, like Jalen said, like being an agent of change is vital. And this probably comes, I think, from a white lens, but I want to just like put this out there that we really do need to educate ourselves on the lived experiences of people who are different than us. As Audre Lorde says, like using our differences as a force for change rather than a device of separatism. And so how do we lean into difference? How do we use that as a strategy and as a powerful tool? I would also just say, find your self-interest. Movements are built also on people like fixing meals, for house meetings, like people like offering childcare. Oh my gosh, offering childcare so that people can like organize and gather and meet and be together in space, in community, doing the work together. Or contributing to funds, donating money if you can, and resources and time and energy. All of those aspects are part of like tracks into activism. So find what you're good at and use it towards justice making and justice seeking.
I love it. I love it. I think you're exactly right. And I think sometimes we probably overlook some of the like more quote unquote basic things that need to be done in order for things to happen publicly, right? There has to be so much background work done, like web stuff. Like thankfully I have, people that are not me who I'll run all the internet stuff for our organization. And all that background work is absolutely critical. It's fundamental. And like literally things would not take place if those jobs weren't done. But that's because those people have those skills to, make websites and events and things like that. So I think that you're right. Sometimes we overlook that work. I was recently reading, unfortunately, I can't remember the woman's name, but after Rosa Parks was arrested, for which prompted the Montgomery boycott, there was a woman who organized making meals for all the activists who were working alongside Rosa Parks for an entire year. They made meals for an entire year. And like, if that's time consuming, that is a lot of work to feed people who are busy trying to do something else and who don't have time to make a meal for themselves. And it also helps create the community. So I was really appreciative when I read that story. I was like, there's so many ways and so many things that you can do. You're absolutely right. Like if websites aren't your thing, if making signs and being out in the street aren't your thing, there's cooking, there's, conversation, there's all kinds of things that people can do. So I know that Amanda and I, in both of our classes, we usually have students do activism projects. And I have found that students are terrified when they're first asked to, go approach this person and ask these questions. And then at the end of that experience, it's like a fire was lit. They're like, oh my God, this was so cool. I didn't know I could do this. And so I just want to encourage anybody else who's out there that's watching, go for it. And, if you need tips, there's lots of organizations, and Jalen, I'm sure, has a list of things that he could have people to be involved with in Greenville as well. So, okay, so I think we've kind of answered almost all of our questions. Do any of you have any final thoughts? I didn't really talk about the national scene for activism. I think one of the things I was thinking about is South Carolina indicative of the national movement? Are we different? Are we the same? I don't know if you guys have any final thoughts about activism in the United States or anything else that you'd like to close with. Jalen, I'll start with you.
Okay. Don't really have any final thoughts other than thank you for inviting me to speak with you two fine ladies about the issues of activism and how we're going about that in South Carolina, whether we're in Myrtle Beach or whether we're in Greenville or wherever we are in this state. I think that South Carolina has injustice and inequality that is more entrenched than what we see nationally. And that means we have to fight all the more hard to rid ourselves of that injustice. Speaking from my experience, it's the long shadow of slavery and Jim Crow still casts itself over the present. And we do ourselves a disservice if we don't acknowledge that and, fight towards a better tomorrow. I think what we see here nationally regarding the Black Lives Matter movement and how it is so different from the civil rights movement in terms of being more inclusive of women, more inclusive of the LGBTQ community. It's a sign of progress for us, in that we are saying that all Black lives matter. And that's been really important on my journey and the journey of the movement as we see it play out today. So given what we've seen in that aspect and what we've seen recently this summer and over the years, I'm very hopeful that South Carolina can get where it needs to be sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I love it. I'm right there with you. Let's do it. Amanda, how about you? Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, same. I'm going to echo Jalen, same. I want to see South Carolina in the same way. I want to step outside and be proud of where I live.
Yeah.
I really do. I want to feel like we're in a community and in a place, an environment that serves everyone. And it doesn't feel like that. It just doesn't. And I want I want students when they come into a classroom to feel like their professors are there for them, like that their professors are in their corner, like supporting them 100%. I want, you know, I just want overall like health and well-being for everyone, you know, a better quality of life. As an artist, I just want to end with this, you know, that when we think about the arts, like arts can really transform culture and society. We can preserve, we can protect, and we can truly liberate ourselves through socially informed creative expression. And sometimes when you package these issues and things like and experiences in the context of performance, it lands on you in a way where you feel more receptive to the possibility of reimagining, of asking questions like, what would the world look like if we didn't have police? What would the world look like if we didn't have rape? What would the world look like if we didn't have da 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 da? Because we've become so normalized and conditioning to these things and aspects being part of the fabric of our existence that we're not really like exercising that imagining muscle to look at it differently and from a different perspective. And I think that arts and narrative and culture and storytelling and arts-based practices can really open up. It's a platform and a vehicle and a mechanism to open up those conversations and to really be strategic about how we can tackle these issues. So that's, I guess, just what I want to end with. So more artist activists, come on, join me. Join Jalen and the amazing work that he is doing in Greenville.
Yes, it really is. I mean, I have been so inspired, Jalen, by everything that you have shared with us. And I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I know that that's a big challenge because liberals were very, not smug, but, we tend to have a good opinion of ourselves. And then when, you're like, actually, this is hurting this community, but you're like, but I didn't do it. It's not my fault. But that's not necessarily true, right? Just the fact that you want to go move into this apartment, can be harming somebody else. So, so thank you for all that you're doing for Greenville and for raising the profile of your community and for, blazing a path forward. I'm so impressed that you're only 28. Maybe I shouldn't announce that, but I feel I'm just in awe of that. At age 28, I'm not sure what I was doing, but it was not that. I can guarantee that I was not doing as much trailblazing work as Jalen was. So thank you. I'm very, very impressed. Amanda, this has been wonderful. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I love your thinking outside the box strategies and imagining new worlds. And we hope to do some of that creative imagination in Myrtle Beach. Hopefully soon we'll be able to get started with that. And so in the middle of this pandemic, you guys have been extremely generous with your time and your ideas and sharing your heart. And I just want to thank you both for participating tonight. This has been one of the best conversations we've had, and I'm so glad that you guys shared your wisdom with us. So thanks very much. I'm going to close out. And thanks to everybody who watched the video tonight. And we will be sure to tune in and share what Jalen and Amanda are up to next. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.